This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. This month is March, and I'm featuring women born or possibly deceased during the month of March. My t-shirt says, "Little women grow up to be great women," and that's a reference, of course, to Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, and she is among the March birthdays that we will be featuring here. For the first day of March, we have Aspasia. Now this is, I believe, an assigned date to her because she lived in the 5th century BC. She was a courtesan in ancient Greece during the glory days of Athens, and the mistress of Pericles, who was a famous Athenian leader, Aspasia. For March 2nd, Anne Frank. Anne Frank, her diary, of course, has been read by now by millions of people. She was a young Jewish girl who hid out with her family in Amsterdam in Holland for a number of years, but they finally were found by the Nazis and sent to concentration camp, where she died in the Bergen-Belsen camp. Actually, they don't know exactly when. She died of typhus in early March of 1945, but her diary has brought her to life and made her emblematic of the victims of the Holocaust of the Nazis. For the 3rd of March, we have another Greek woman, ancient Greek woman, called Hypatia. Hypatia. This is actually March 3rd was her death day. And she was a mathematician. This ancient picture shows her with a pen in hand, and it looks as if it's made of mosaic. And that would have been the case, so it probably is an ancient rendering of Hypatia. Now, she was martyred. She was martyred by the Christians. That is to say, Saint Cyril spoke against her. She was, like I say, a famous mathematician, scientist, but a pagan, and he urged on a mob which tore her to pieces, which sounds like a terrible thing, obviously, and you wonder, but of course that was a time when many of the Christians were suffering martyrdom. Hypatia of Greece died in 415 AD. On the 4th day of March, we have a woman, a Russian woman called Maria Bokharevna. Now this woman, she doesn't look much like a woman because her hair is all under her hat there, but she was a warrior, and so it's very appropriate to show her in a warrior uniform. She organized a battalion of women that fought in the early days of the Soviets in 1917, over 100 years ago, in Russia. And the Soviets opposed her, actually, but she was a part of the Russian Revolution in 1917, and she just vanished finally. But she did lead a battalion of women soldiers during the Russian Revolution. For the 5th of March, Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg was a Polish woman, a famous radical founder of the Socialist Party. She was born on March 5th in 1870, and she was a founder both of the Socialist Party in Poland and also well known in Eastern Europe before the before the First World War. She founded both a Socialist Party and then a Communist Party during World War I. And she was eventually captured by opponents of the Soviet revolution and shot. Rosa Luxemburg. For the 6th of March, we have a death day in the year 1888 in Boston of Louisa May Alcott. Here's a picture of Louisa May Alcott as a young woman. Of course, she was a famous author, especially of children's books. She started out actually writing articles and sort of, fantastic stories for magazines, but she eventually became famous for her children's literature, including Little Women, and that's why I asked to have my T-shirt shown at the beginning that says, "Little women grow up to be great women." She not only wrote Little Women, but also Rose in Bloom, and Under the Lilacs. Jo's Boys, I think, was perhaps her last book. But she died, like I say, in 1888 at age 55 in Boston, Louisa May Alcott. For the 7th of March, we have, I guess this is a regular birthday for Artemisia Gentileschi. Artemisia Gentileschi here shown in a self-portrait as a martyr, but a painting that she herself did, and so we think that it probably shows pretty much what Artemisia Gentileschi looked like. She was born in 1593, quite a long time ago, but she was a painter, and there are a number of extant paintings done by her which show her face, what she looked like. She was well known in her time, and actually she was the daughter of a painter, but she surpassed her father eventually in fame. For the 8th day of March, Anne Bonny. Anne Bonny, here shown as a pirate, because she was famous for being a pirate. Now it says that she was born in the year 1700 in Cork, in Ireland, but she couldn't have been a pirate for too long, because it says that in 1721 she was captured. She would have been only 21 years old at the time, but she had persevered for a couple of years as a pirate, and so they were bound to hang her for depredations as a pirate. However, at the time she was expecting a baby, and so they waited until the baby was born. And then actually it turned out she had disappeared somehow. But she was best known as a pirate, and since she disappeared or was captured in 1721, then by 1722, when the baby was born, somehow she was no longer around, but her name has come down in history as a woman pirate, and so this shows her as she might have looked as a pirate in the 18th century. Number 9 for the March 9th is a death date, and it's a woman, Harriet Tubman, a famous member of the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman is known for having saved, they think, as many as 300 slaves. She made 19 trips from the South, leading enslaved people to freedom in the North. 19 trips during the time of slavery and her activities in the Underground Railroad. She was born about 1820, and she lived until 1913 to be a very old lady in her 90s when she died in New York in that year, 1913. But this is Harriet Tubman, probably the most famous person who was active in the so-called Underground Railway that helped slaves escape from slavery in the South into freedom into the northern part of the United States. Well, looks like I've missed someone here. And that's Carrie Chapman Catt. There she is. Sorry. She was actually died. She actually died on the 9th of March. And by that time, she was living in New Rochelle in New York. And the year was 1947. So she was born about 1860. She started out as a reporter, but she became a very famous female suffragist and was working for many years for women to get the right to vote. And when that came about in 1920, she was a founder of the League of Women Voters. So she's probably most famous for being a suffragist for a number of years, a long number of years, and then founding the League of Women Voters in 1920. That was March 9th. I've already described March 10th for Harriet Tubman. And the next person for March 11th, this is a death date for Zelda Fitzgerald. The picture shows both Zelda and her husband, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Both were authors. He was a more famous author, probably, of course, but Zelda also wrote and published works during her lifetime. She was born in 1901 and died in 1948. And she had had problems during her lifetime with mental illness. And in fact, tragically, she died in a hospital, a mental health hospital, which got on fire, and she was one of the fire victims. Zelda Fitzgerald, she died in Asheville, North Carolina, 1948. For the 12th of March, we see Lady Hester Stanhope. Lady Hester Stanhope was a famous traveler. She was one of those people who didn't stay at home, for sure. She was born in England, in Kent, in England in 1776. And she died in her 70s while in Egypt. She was on a trip to the Near East, and was in Egypt at the time. But it's interesting that she was related to Prime Minister William Pitt of Great Britain, and she was in fact a niece of his, and she served as his hostess. Apparently he wasn't married at the time, and so his niece, Lady Hester Stanhope, served as his hostess when he was Prime Minister, William Pitt. And as thanks for having done that, she was his hostess for like about 4 or 5 years in the very early in the 19th century, like about 1804. She was given a parliamentary pension, and that was a lifetime pension, so they were sending her some money for a number of years after she finished her service as the hostess of Prime Minister William Pitt, and finally, like I say, Lady Hester Stanhope died in 1839 in the country of Egypt. For the 13th of March, we have a woman called Messalina, and they aren't sure when she lived exactly, but she was the wife of the Emperor Claudius of Rome in the 1st century A.D., and she was a very very cruel person, and assaulted and had people who were Christians martyred during her time, so that her name became associated with these cruelties, and her name was actually, because she was the wife of the Emperor Claudius, there were some monuments in Rome which included her name. And after her own death, she was in such bad feelings of Christians who lived later that they made sure that her name was expunged from any monument that might associate her with the Emperor Claudius. She died in 48 AD, which was, exceedingly early in the Christian times, of course, only shortly after the death of Christ. For the 14th of March, we see Fannie Lee Hamer, or perhaps Fannie Lou Hamer. And here she is with one of her well-known sayings, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." And she had that feeling because as a black woman, in the times of the civil rights uproar in the 1960s and so on, she said that, and she meant it, and of course it was because of the bad treatment that blacks were getting, especially in the South. She was associated with the Freedom Democratic Party, which challenged a regular Democratic Party, which composed entirely of white people in her area of the South. And in 1964, this challenge occurred. I don't believe that the Freedom Democratic Party was actually seated in place of the all-white Democratic group that had gone up there to the National Convention of the Democrats, but in any case, she came to national attention as part of the delegation of the Freedom Democratic Party people in 1964. And she was assaulted by white people. She was beaten by a white man and suffered a sort of martyrdom. She didn't die from that. She lived on to be, a spokesperson for the rights of black people. But she did have that party problem. And she was fired from her job where she lived in the South by her white bosses because of her political activities in support of black rights. Fannie Lee, or possibly Lou Hamer, of Mississippi. She died in 1977, so she was around for quite a long time after this 1964, at least a dozen years after this 1964 effort with the Freedom Democratic Party. March 15th is a death day of Mary Wilkins Freeman, who died in New Jersey in 1930 at age 77. She was a well-known author of her times, and she was one of the first two female recognized by the Arts and Letters, the Institute for Arts and Letters in the United States. And she wrote mostly about strong, middle-aged women. That was sort of her signature kind of writing. She died in New Jersey in 1930. For the 16th of March, we have a French woman, Rosa Bonheur, an artist, French artist, born in 1822 on March 16th. She was famous for her portraits, you might say, of animals. She lived during the 19th century, basically, and did many pictures, many paintings of cattle and horses and animals, and was recognized as a particularly good painter of animals. She wore short hair, which was unusual for that time, of course. And since she was French, she qualified eventually for the Legion of Honor, the French Legion of Honor, which was very seldom given to women. She was one of the first women who ever received recognition in France as a member of the Legion of Honor. And for the 16th also, we have another birth date in 1850 of a German woman, Caroline Herschel. Now, Caroline Herschel's brother was an astronomer, and she became an astronomer also and worked with her brother for many years, long enough that they discovered 1,000 variable stars and many double stars. But they were there every night out with the telescope and looking up into the heavens and finding important stars, and maybe not so important, just more and more stars during the 19th century, basically, since she was born in 1850. For the 17th of March, there's a woman called Malinche of Mexico, and she was born about 1504. She was born, it shows her with a kind of a crown on because she was the daughter of a cacique, a chief leader in Mexico at the time when the Spaniard Cortez came to Mexico and eventually defeated the natives there and took over Mexico for Spain. But Malinche was essentially an Indian princess who was enslaved. But she aided Cortez, and now Mexicans use her name, or perhaps her nickname, Malinche, to mean traitor, because she helped the Spaniards take over in Mexico. On March 18th, we have Margaret Brent, an English woman born about the year 1601. That's rather early on for a picture, but this was the best we could find. Margaret Brent of England. She was a Catholic woman who emigrated from England and moved to Maryland, which, of course, you know, Maryland was founded by English Catholics who were not welcome in England at the time, which had, of course, gone to the Church of England for the most part in the early part of the 17th century. So Margaret Brent moved to Maryland, the colony of Maryland, in 1638 and became the first female freeholder. That is to say, she owned land, the first woman to own land on her own behalf. Apparently she was not married, but she was a well-to-do woman and was able to purchase land and become a freeholder, the first female freeholder in the state of, in those days, of course, the colony of Maryland in the United States. Long before the United States actually occurred, right? Because it wasn't till 1776, so about 150 years after her birth, that Maryland and the other colonies became or asserted independence in 1776. For the 19th of March, we have Alexandra Kollontai, a Russian woman. She was a revolutionary born in Russia in 1872, and she was the only woman who was actually an official in the first Bolshevik government when the communists took over in Russia in 1917-18. She was actually in the first cabinet of the Bolshevik government. And she also served as an ambassador, for she was the first woman official ambassador, apparently, in history. And so she's remembered, Alexandra Kollontai, Russian woman, for her activity in the revolutionary government in Russia under the Bolsheviks in the early part of the 20th century, 1917-18. For March 20th, we have a death date, Adriana Lecouvreur. She died in Paris in the year 1770 at age 37, which is rather early, okay? And in fact, she died suddenly, and there were rumors that somebody had poisoned her. She was an actress, and like I say, died at only age 37, so that must have been like in the year 1807. Adriana Lecouvreur. For 21st of March, there was another death day. This is of the British heroine, Boadicea. This statue shows her and her daughters. She was a British native and the daughter of the king of East Anglia. And when the Romans came to Britain early on, they were, killing Brits right and left, and she was one of the people who organized resistance to the Roman invasion of Britain. And this statue is on one of the famous London bridges, showing Boadicea, or Boudica, her name spelled various ways, leading the Brits against the Roman invasion with her two daughters. For the 22nd of March, Aphra Behn, born in Canterbury in 1640. Now, it's said that she was a spy against the Dutch during a time when the Dutch and the British were at war back in the 17th century, since she was, like I say, born in 1640. But she was a well-known author of her time. She wrote 17 plays in 17 years, they say. But they were kind of rakish plays, and so the Victorians were rather scandalized by these plays, and they spoke out against them and sort of made sure that they weren't being put on the stage anymore in England in the 19th century. But she certainly was a prolific playwright of her own day in the 17th century in England, Aphra Behn. For the 23rd of March, Florence Ellingwood Allen. She has connections with the state of Ohio. Her parents were from Ohio, although she was born in Utah, and her father was actually served as a congressman from Utah to the U.S. Congress at the time she was born. She died in 1968, relatively recent times, at age 95. Oops, pardon me, I'm reading the wrong line here. She died in 1884. Or she was born in 1884. Her father was this Utah congressman. She was a lawyer, and as a lawyer, she was a pioneer judge. She was a judge in Cleveland. She was the first woman judge in Cleveland. She was the first woman judge on the Ohio Supreme Court at a time when she was the first Supreme Court justice of who was a woman in the whole United States. And later she became the first female federal judge in 1934. Some people wondered why she wasn't actually named eventually to the U.S. Supreme Court, but she didn't do that. She was the federal judge, and she was the presiding federal judge for part of the state of Ohio, Florence Ellingwood Allen. For the 24th of March, Alice Guy Blaich, born in France, she died in New Jersey in 1968, age 95, and she was a pioneer film director. She directed some 200 films between 1996 and 1926. Now, of course, that was during the silent era of films before they had talkies. But she was a pioneer woman film director during the silent times of the movies. For the 25th of March, Flannery O'Connor, born in Georgia in 1925 on March 25th. She was a devout Catholic. She wrote, she was a well-known author during her day, and she wrote grandiose tales, but she eventually became sick with lupus, which is a very serious illness, and finally carried her off, Flannery O'Connor. The 26th of March, there's another O'Connor, even more recent times, Sandra Day O'Connor. Here she is. This is probably showing her taking oath of office as the first woman on the United States Supreme Court, and that was during the 1970s. She was, no, it must have been the 1980s, because she was appointed by Ronald Reagan. She had been a judge and a justice in the state of Arizona, and I remember her well because she was actually at Stanford University at the same time I was, although I didn't know her, of course. But she was born in El Paso in 1930, so she was only a year or two older than I am, and the first woman on the U.S. Supreme Court. The 27th of March shows a woman called Hatchet. This is a nickname, actually. She was a woman warrior in the 15th century who organized women to fight and drive back the Burgundians. The Burgundians were besieging the French town of Beauvais, and she organized women to fight them. She even captured the Burgundian flag, and threw it into the moat or something like that. And Louis XI was so impressed with Hatchet that he exempted her family forever from paying taxes. So all of her descendants, supposedly, to this day do not pay French taxes because Louis XI exempted her way back in the 15th century for her patriotism in France. The 28th of March is Dorothy Hodgkin's birth in Egypt in 1950. She was the first scientist to solve one of the mysteries of the vitamin B12 by the use of computer. So she is credited with this computer use in the first real use of computers in finding out mysteries about chemical things. So, in fact, eventually she was given the Nobel Prize for Chemistry for her work with computers, her pioneer work with computers, Dorothy Hodgkin. For the 29th, we have Hannah Reich. This is a German woman pilot, and it shows her giving the Nazi salute because she was a German pilot, a Nazi, during the First World War. She was active, and she was obviously, if she worked for the Nazis, that was later because they were big in the Second World War. But she was also a pioneer as a pilot of helicopters, Hannah Reich. She didn't fight in combat, but she did practically everything else. She set records, altitude records and things like that as a pilot in Germany, born in 1912 and active during the Nazi era. For the 30th of March, we see Julia Jackson. Now, it says that Julia Jackson was a woman in New Orleans who was known as a voodoo, a practicer of voodoo magic, which of course has rather serious implications of evil usually attached to the whole idea of voodooism. But we don't really have any idea what she looked like. She lived in the 1800s, and this picture came up, so we chose this one to impersonate Julia Jackson, the voodoo woman of New Orleans. And finally, for the last day of March, the 31st of March, we have, this is obviously not it's obviously a picture of a real person, but it is not the picture of Alcanza, because Alcanza was an Arabian woman who lived about the year 575 AD. In fact, she was one of the pioneer Islamic people. She became a Muslim during the time of Muhammad himself, who, was not around until about the year 600 AD. And she was a poet and what they call elegiac poet. She wrote elegies. Elegies are poems that celebrate the lives of people who have died, especially people who have died heroically. And it says that she lost 2 brothers in a battle and 4 sons who were killed in battle. So she had quite a few elegies to write in her day, back in about the year 600 in the 7th century AD. This elegiac poet, Muslim convert, and a lot of her poetry is still around because she was not only famous in her own day, but is still revered as an Islamic poet. It says that over 1,000 verses of hers are still extant for Al-Kanza, the Arabian woman poet, born about the year 575, but who became an Islamic convert after Islam was around, after Muhammad developed the religion of Islam in the 7th century AD. So there we have 31 women for the month of March, and quite a variety, obviously, from artists like Rosa Bonheur, the woman who was so well known in the 19th century for her pictures of animals, especially draft animals and cattle. And authors like Mary Wilkins Freeman, many authors, women activists like Fannie Lou Hamer, who is someone I can remember when she first came to national attention as a member of the Democratic Freedom Party of Mississippi. And long ago, folks, scientists like Caroline Herschel, the astronomer who worked with her brother in discovering many, many stars during the, early in the 19th century, since she was born in 1750 herself. Ancient women like Boudica or Boadicea, the British heroine who opposed the Roman invasion, which occurred in the 1st century AD, and women like Alexandra Kollontai, who was a famous revolutionary of the early, the 1917-18 time, and the only woman who served in the Soviet, the first Soviet government, actually, and also was a pioneer woman ambassador, one of the very first of the women ambassadors. People like Florence Ellenwood Allen, they have a picture of her which is very interesting in my book. It's a women's suffrage headquarters picture. And it says, "Women's suffrage, men of Ohio, give the women a square deal and vote for the amendment for women's suffrage." This was in 1912. And it wasn't actually, of course, until 1920 that women got the right to vote in Ohio. But there's a picture of Florence Ellenwood Allen, who became this pioneer judge, first in Ohio and on the Ohio Supreme Court, as the first woman justice in the country of the United States, when she was elected to the Ohio Supreme Court in the 1920s and became the first federal female judge in 1934. And people like Hannah Wright, there's quite a picture of her in my book here, but the one that we showed you on the air showed her giving the Nazi salute during the Nazi era. But she was a famous woman pilot who made altitude records and that kind of thing. Not to mention 2 women named O'Connor, one being Flannery O'Connor, who was an author, and the other Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman on the U.S. Supreme Court. And I remembered just having a feeling of connection with her because she was from the part of the United States where I grew up. She was born in El Paso, but she served as a judge and justice in the state of Arizona, near my own home state of Nevada. And she also attended the Stanford University in California at the same time that I was there, as it turned out. Not that I ever knew her there, but we were contemporaries since she was born in 1930. And interestingly enough, she gave up she resigned from the Supreme Court eventually, after having served for quite a long time, over a decade. She served on the U.S. Supreme Court for over a decade, and she finally resigned from the Supreme Court in order to care for her husband, who was ill with Alzheimer's disease. And he eventually, as tragically often happens with Alzheimer's, he got to the point where he didn't know who she was, and he fell in love with another woman even, because he didn't remember who he was and that he was actually married to Sandra Day. His name was O'Connor, of course. So we have quite a few interesting women from the month of March. We have interesting women all the time. And as my shirt says, the little women can grow up to be great women. This is Lois Whaley, And this has been Women Today and Yesterday, which I have on the air, usually, I believe, at 7 o'clock on TV. So if you're watching this now, just happen to be going through and you came across it, that's when my time is, a regular time, 7 o'clock in the evening. And they also say I'm on at like 1 in the morning. Usually by that time I'm fast asleep in bed, and I can't say that I've ever seen myself on TV at 1 o'clock in the morning, but maybe someone out there has been able to find me on Athens Community Television, which is our wonderful local television station here. So thanks a lot, Matt Green, for keeping us on the air, and thank you to our viewers, and keep on watching your local TV. This is Lois Whaley, and have a happy March. This is the first day of March, and we're going to have 31 more days. So there'll be a word of women who were either born or possibly died on during the month of March for the following couple of weeks.